June 6th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel, and the beaches of Normandy are erupting in fire and blood. American soldiers are scrambling up Omaha Beach, faces pressed into the sand as machine gun fire tears through the air above them. British troops are pushing inland from Gold and Sword. Canadians are fighting house to house in the ruins of coastal towns. This is D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 156,000 troops are hitting the beaches of northern France in a single day, supported by 5,000 ships and 11,000 aircraft. The fate of the war, and perhaps the fate of civilization itself, hangs on whether they can secure a foothold before the German army crushes them back into the sea. But here's what makes the event miraculous. It's not just the courage of the men storming those beaches, it's what's happening 300 kilometers away at German high command. Inside a concrete bunker in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler is pacing. His generals surround him, maps spread across the table, reports flooding in from Normandy. The news is catastrophic. The Allies have breached the Atlantic Wall. They are establishing beachheads. Reinforcements are needed immediately. But Hitler is not panicking. In fact, he seems almost calm. Because he knows something his generals don't. He knows this invasion, as massive as it appears, is not the real invasion. The real invasion is coming. And when it does, he will be ready. Hitler has held back his most powerful reserve force, the 15th Army, 350,000 of his best troops, stationed not in Normandy, but 150 miles northeast in the Pas-de-Calais region. They are the crack units, the elite divisions, the Wehrmacht's finest soldiers and their best tanks. They could turn the tide at Normandy in hours. They could drive the Allies back into the Channel and end the invasion before it begins. But Hitler refuses to move them. He orders them to stay exactly where they are, because the intelligence is clear. Normandy is a diversion. The real invasion will come at Calais. The reports have been consistent for months. His most trusted agent, his most valuable spy operating inside Britain, has confirmed it again and again. The main Allied force is assembling in southeast England. They are preparing to strike across the narrowest point of the Channel, directly at Calais. And when they do, the 15th Army will be there to meet them. So the 15th Army waits. And while they wait, 156,000 Allied troops dig into Normandy, secure their beaches, and begin the liberation of Europe. The most critical German force in Western Europe sits frozen in place, defending against an invasion that will never come. They are waiting for a ghost army, a phantom force that exists only in Hitler's mind. And the reason Hitler believes in that ghost is because of one man. A man who started his journey not as a master spy or a trained operative, but as a complete amateur, a rejected failure, a dreamer who was too naive, too idealistic, and too stubborn to understand that he had no business being a spy at all. His name was Juan Pujol García. And before we get to D-Day and the greatest deception of World War II, we need to go back to where it all began. Not in the halls of British intelligence, not in the secret training camps of MI6, but in a cheap hotel room in Lisbon, Portugal, where a Spanish nobody with no training, no contacts, and no credibility decided to do something so audacious, so impossible, that it would change the course of history. Barcelona, Spain, 1936. Juan was 24 years old, and he had already failed at nearly everything he'd tried. He was not a soldier. He was not from a family of wealth or influence. His father had owned a small dye factory that went bankrupt during Spain's economic collapse. His mother came from a modest Catalan family with no political connections. Juan grew up ordinary in every way. He was short, soft-spoken, unremarkable in appearance. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a clerk than a hero. He had drifted through a series of jobs, managing a chicken farm, working in a hotel, selling fabric. He had no particular talent for deception, no training in espionage, no reason to believe he could ever be useful in a war. But he had one thing that would prove more powerful than training or talent or connections. He had conviction, because Juan had seen what dictatorship looked like up close, and he hated it with every fibre of his being. Spain in 1936 was tearing itself apart. The Spanish Civil War had just begun, a brutal conflict that would serve as a rehearsal for World War II. On one side, the Republicans, a coalition of Democrats, socialists and anarchists, fighting to preserve Spain's elected government. On the other side, the nationalists led by General Francisco Franco, backed by Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy, were determined to install a fascist dictatorship. Juan watched his country descend into savagery. He watched neighbors turn on neighbors. He watched fascist death squads execute Republicans in the streets and communist militias purge their own ranks of anyone suspected of disloyalty. And he came to a conclusion. He despised them both. He hated the fascists for their brutality and their worship of strongmen. He hated the communists for their ruthless dogma and their willingness to devour their own. What Juan believed in was democracy, the messy, imperfect human system where people could disagree without killing each other. It was an unfashionable position in 1936. Europe was choosing sides. You were either fascist or communist. There was no middle ground. But Juan refused to choose. He would fight for democracy, even if democracy didn't seem to want him. When the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939 with Franco's victory, Juan found himself living under a fascist dictatorship. Spain was now aligned with Nazi Germany. And when World War II began that same year, Juan knew where his loyalties lay. He wanted to fight for the Allies. He wanted to do something to stop Hitler, but he had no idea how. So in 1941, he did the only thing he could think of. He walked into the British Embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. The meeting lasted approximately 7 minutes. The British intelligence officer barely looked up from his paperwork. Juan explained his situation. He spoke Spanish and Catalan. He had no love for the Nazis, and he wanted to help. The officer asked about his experience. Juan admitted he had none. The officer asked about his connections. Juan had none of those either. The officer asked why Britain should trust a random Spanish civilian with no credentials and no references. Juan had no answer to that. The officer dismissed him politely but firmly. Juan tried the Americans next. Same result. Then the French. Then anyone who would listen. But every Allied embassy in Madrid turned him away. He was useless, a dreamer with no skills and no value. Most people would have given up. Most people would have gone home, accepting that the war would be fought by professionals. But Juan was not most people, because somewhere in that string of rejections, an idea began to form. An idea so crazy that it should never have worked. If the British wouldn't hire him as a spy, maybe the Germans would. And if the Germans hired him, maybe the British would finally take him seriously. He would become a double agent. Not by being recruited and flipped, the traditional route, but by volunteering for the enemy specifically to betray them. He would trick the Nazis into thinking he was working for them, and then he would use that position to feed them lies. It was a plan that violated every rule of espionage, and it required Juan to do something that should have been impossible for an amateur with no training. He would have to convince the Abwehr, German military intelligence, that he was a valuable asset. January 1941. Lisbon, Portugal. Juan arrived in the Portuguese capital with almost nothing: a small suitcase, a few hundred pesetas, and a determination that bordered on delusion. Lisbon, in 1941, was the spy capital of Europe. Portugal was neutral, which meant it was the one place where agents from both sides could operate openly. The cafes were full of informants. The hotels were bugged. Everyone was watching everyone else. For a trained operative, it was a target-rich environment. For Juan, amateur hour personified, it was utterly overwhelming. But he had one advantage. He looked harmless. He looked exactly like what he was: a nobody. Juan checked into a cheap hotel under a false name. He sat down at a rickety table, pulled out a typewriter he'd purchased with his last money, and began to write. He wrote a letter to the German embassy. In it, he introduced himself as a Spanish businessman with nationalist sympathies, a devoted admirer of Adolf Hitler, and a burning desire to serve the Reich. He claimed he had connections in Britain and could provide valuable intelligence. It was all lies. He had never been to Britain. He had no connections anywhere. But he wrote with confidence and conviction. He mailed the letter, and then he waited. 3 weeks passed. Nothing. Juan was running out of money. He was beginning to think the entire plan was doomed. And then, one morning, a knock on his hotel room door. 2 men stood in the hallway. Dark suits, serious expressions. They asked if he was the man who had written to the embassy. Juan's heart was pounding so hard he thought they could hear it, but he nodded. They invited him to come with them. Not a request, an invitation that felt like an order. Juan followed them to a car, then to an unmarked building in central Lisbon. And there, in a small office with the curtains drawn, he met his first German intelligence officer. The officer was middle-aged. He looked Juan up and down. He did not seem impressed. He asked him why he wanted to help Germany. Juan delivered his prepared answer. He hated the communists. He admired order and the strength of the Reich. The officer asked what Juan could offer. Juan said he had business contacts in Britain. He could travel there. He could observe military installations, troop movements, shipping activity. The officer asked how Juan would communicate. Juan had thought about this. He said he could send reports by courier through Portugal, encoded in business correspondence. It was a decent cover story. Not brilliant, but plausible enough for someone with no training. The officer studied Juan for a long time. Then, to Juan's amazement, he nodded. The Abwehr would give him a chance. They would pay for his travel, provide him with a code name, invisible ink, and a contact protocol. In return, they expected results. If Juan delivered, he would be rewarded. If he failed, or if they suspected betrayal, the consequences would be immediate and final. Juan agreed to everything. He walked back to his hotel in a daze. The problem he faced was impossible. He had just convinced the Germans he was their spy in Britain. But he wasn't in Britain. He had never been to Britain. He had no way of getting to Britain. Spain and Portugal were neutral, but travel to England from Iberian soil was nearly impossible in 1941. The British controlled access, and they weren't handing out visas to Spanish civilians with vague business claims. So he made a decision that should have ended his intelligence career before it began. He decided not to go to Britain at all. He would simply pretend he was there. From his hotel room in Lisbon, Juan Pujol García began to construct an entirely fictional intelligence network operating inside a country he had never seen. His tools were absurdly inadequate. He had a tourist guidebook, the Blue Guide to England, the kind of things sold to holidaymakers planning trips to the countryside. He had a map of Britain torn from a library magazine. He had access to Portuguese newspapers, which occasionally reprinted British news. And he had something far more powerful than any of that. He had imagination. Juan began writing reports. The first ones were cautious, generic observations that could have come from anyone reading a newspaper. He reported on the mood in London after German bombing raids. He mentioned troop trains moving through the countryside. The Germans were unimpressed. They wanted specifics, dates, locations, military units, the kind of hard intelligence that could only come from someone actually on the ground. So, Juan gave them specifics. He made them up. He reported seeing a convoy of troop ships departing from Liverpool, headed for Malta. He described the markings on the ships, the weather conditions, the time of departure. It was all fiction, but it was detailed fiction. The Germans took the reports seriously. They sent reconnaissance aircraft to search for the convoy. They wasted time, fuel, and resources chasing a fleet that never existed. And when they found nothing, they didn't blame Juan. They assumed the convoy had changed course or that their own intelligence had failed to intercept it. Juan realized something crucial in that moment. The Germans were desperate for intelligence from inside Britain, and if he gave them reports that fit their expectations, they would accept them without too much scrutiny. Because the thing about intelligence work is this: no one can verify everything. If you produce results, then intelligence agencies trust them. And Juan was about to exploit that trust on a scale no one had ever attempted before. By mid-1941, Juan's reports were becoming more elaborate, but he realized he had a problem. One agent, even a well-placed one, couldn't possibly gather all the intelligence the Germans were demanding. They wanted eyes in multiple cities, access to different military installations, observations from across the country. So Juan created more spies. He invented an entire network of sub-agents, fictional characters who existed only in his reports, but who became completely real to the Abwehr. There was Agent 1, a Portuguese commercial traveller who moved between London and the provinces. There was Agent 2, a nationalist with a deep hatred for the English, eager to undermine the British war effort. There was Agent 3, a Venezuelan student living in Glasgow who could report on naval activity in Scottish ports. There was Agent 4, a waiter in a London restaurant frequented by military officers, who overheard conversations about troop deployments. Juan gave each of them detailed backstories. He gave them personalities and weaknesses. The Abwehr began paying Juan for his growing network. They sent money through Portuguese intermediaries, hundreds and then thousands of dollars, to cover the salaries of his imaginary agents. Juan kept detailed records, tracking payments and expenses. The irony was extraordinary. The Germans were funding a spy network that existed only in the imagination of a man sitting in a Lisbon hotel room, making up stories based on a tourist guidebook. But the Abwehr didn't just trust Juan's network. they promoted him. They gave him a code name, Alaric. It was a name that suggested power, conquest, the overthrow of empires. By early 1942, Juan had created 27 fictional agents spread across the United Kingdom. Some were primary sources, reporting directly to him. Others were sub-agents. The network had code names, payment schedules, and elaborate security protocols. And then, in February 1942, Juan made a mistake. It was the mistake that would change everything. He reported a major convoy sailing from Liverpool to Malta, packed with supplies and reinforcements. He gave specific details, ship names, departure times, and escort formations. The Germans scrambled their forces. They repositioned U-boats across the Atlantic and prepared the Luftwaffe for intercept missions. And they waited. The convoy never appeared. But this time, the absence was too obvious to ignore. German intelligence began to ask questions. They started to notice inconsistencies. But those questions didn't travel to Juan in Lisbon. They travelled to London, to the desk of a British intelligence analyst named Desmond Bristow. Bristow worked for MI6's Iberian section, monitoring German intelligence activities in Spain and Portugal. His job was to track enemy agents, intercept communications, and identify threats to British operations. And in early 1942, he began to notice something strange. The Germans were moving resources, significant resources, based on intelligence that appeared to be coming from inside Britain. But MI6 had no record of any German agent operating at that level. They began intercepting and decoding messages between the Abwehr and an agent codenamed Alaric. The reports were detailed, consistent, and apparently coming from a well-developed spy network. But the intelligence was wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. Bristow came to a stunning conclusion. There was a German agent somewhere fabricating an entire intelligence network, and he was doing it so convincingly that the Abwehr believed every word. But who was he? And more importantly, why was he doing it? MI6 began a quiet investigation. They traced the communications back through Lisbon. They identified intermediaries, followed money transfers, and eventually discovered a name, Juan Pujol García, a Spanish national with no intelligence training and no obvious qualifications. When they pulled his file, they discovered something even more remarkable. This was the same man who had walked into the British embassy in Madrid 2 years earlier, offering to spy for the Allies. In April 1942, British agents made contact with Juan in Lisbon. They didn't arrest him. They simply asked him a question. Would you like to come to London? Would you like to do this work properly with our support? Juan didn't hesitate. He said yes immediately, because this was what he had wanted all along, not to be a German spy, but to be a weapon against them. In May 1942, Juan arrived in London for the first time in his life, the city he had been reporting from for over a year. The British gave him a handler, a brilliant MI5 officer named Thomas Harris. They gave him a code name that would become legendary, Garbo. The name was inspired by the actress Greta Garbo, because like her, Juan was the greatest performer of his generation. He could make an audience believe anything. And now, with British support, he would perform the role of his life. Garbo's operation became one of the most sophisticated deceptions in military history. They helped him refine his agents' personalities, making them even more believable. They gave Garbo resources, proper intelligence, carefully selected pieces of true information mixed with fiction, and access to real military activities that could be safely reported without compromising security. The key to Garbo's success was understanding how intelligence works. Real spies don't have perfect information. They report what they see, often too late to be actionable. They make mistakes. They misinterpret things. So Garbo's reports mixed three types of information. First, complete fiction, invented details that sent the Germans chasing ghosts. Second, harmless facts, accurate information about minor activities that proved Garbo had real access. Third, valuable information deliberately delayed, accurate intelligence that arrived too late to be useful, but verified Garbo's credibility. You can imagine Garbo reporting on a convoy leaving port with perfect accuracy, ship names, cargo, destination, everything. But his report arrived after the convoy had already reached its destination. The Germans couldn't act on it, but they could verify it. And when they confirmed that Garbo's information was accurate, their trust in him deepened. By 1943, Garbo had become the Abwehr's most valuable asset in Britain. His network of 27 fictional agents was producing more intelligence than any other German operation. Berlin trusted him completely. They paid him a fortune. They awarded him commendations. And all the while, he was feeding them poison disguised as food. But the true test, the operation that would define Garbo's entire career, was still to come. It was called Operation Fortitude, and it was built around the biggest lie of the war. In 1943, the Allies began planning the invasion of Europe. They knew that success depended not just on military strength, but on deception. If they could convince Hitler that the invasion was coming somewhere other than the actual landing site, they could reduce German resistance and save thousands of lives. The plan was audacious. They would create a fake army. The fake army was called the First United States Army Group, FUSAG. On paper, it was a massive force, over 1 million men, assembled in southeast England directly across the Channel from Pas-de-Calais. In reality, FUSAG didn't exist. The soldiers were inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft. The radio traffic was scripted transmissions designed to simulate military activity. But the Allies knew that rubber tanks and fake radio signals wouldn't be enough. They needed someone the Germans trusted completely to confirm what they wanted to believe. They needed Garbo. Garbo's fictional agents began reporting on FUSAG in late 1943. They described seeing American troops flooding into Kent and Sussex. One of Garbo's agents, supposedly based in Dover, sent detailed reports on seeing General George Patton, America's most famous and feared commander, touring the area. Patton's presence was the ultimate confirmation. The Allies had deliberately assigned him to command the fake army, knowing that the Germans would assume the real invasion would be led by their most formidable opponent. The Germans believed every word. They began redirecting resources to defend Calais. They reinforced the 15th Army. They positioned their best divisions, their most advanced tanks, and their strongest coastal defences exactly where FUSAG appeared to be preparing to strike. And then came D-Day, June 6, 1944. The real invasion hit Normandy, not Calais. And Hitler, convinced by Garbo's reports that Normandy was a diversion, refused to move the 15th Army. But Garbo's greatest performance came not before the day, but during it. Because on the evening of June the 6th, with Allied troops already on the beaches, Garbo sent an urgent message to Berlin. He reported that his agents had confirmed massive troop concentrations still in southeast England. Fusag was still there, still preparing. Normandy was indeed a feint. The real invasion, the main assault, was still coming at Calais. The message was marked urgent, requiring immediate attention at the highest levels. It reached Hitler himself within hours, and it convinced him to keep waiting. He held back the 15th Army for weeks, waiting for an invasion that would never come. By the time Hitler realized he had been deceived, the Allies had secured Normandy, landed over 1 million troops, and begun the liberation of Europe. The 15th Army, the force that could have crushed the invasion, had sat idle, defending against a ghost. Garbo's deception had worked perfectly. He had saved the day, and the Germans never suspected him. They believed, until the very end, that he was their most loyal spy. In fact, they honored him for his service. In July 1944, Nazi Germany awarded Juan the Iron Cross, second class, one of their highest military decorations. He was the only person in history to receive the Iron Cross from Nazi Germany for helping to destroy it. But the British honored him too. In 1944, King George VI personally approved Juan's appointment as a member of the Order of the British Empire, the MBE, for services to His Majesty's government. He is the only human being ever decorated by both sides of World War II for the exact same work. The Nazis gave him the Iron Cross because they thought he was their hero. The British gave him the MBE because they knew he was theirs. When the war ended in May 1945, Juan faced a new problem. The Third Reich had collapsed, but thousands of Nazi officers and intelligence operatives had escaped. Many were in hiding, nursing grudges, making lists of traitors. If any of them discovered that Alaric, their most trusted spy, had been a double agent all along, Juan's life would be worthless. Vengeance would be inevitable. So the British helped him disappear. They faked his death. In 1949, they created a story that Juan had died of malaria in Angola, a plausible end for a Spanish businessman traveling in Africa. They planted the obituary in Spanish newspapers. And then they helped him start a new life under a new name, in a place where no one would think to look for him: Venezuela. For the next 40 years, Juan lived anonymously in Caracas. He worked as a bookseller and a language teacher. He lived in a modest apartment. He spoke to almost no one about his past. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite man who read constantly and occasionally told stories about Spain before the war. They had no idea they were living next to one of the greatest spies in history. Juan married, raised a family, and grew old in anonymity. And he stayed silent, because even decades later, he wasn't certain that speaking would be safe. The Nazi networks had long memories. It wasn't until 1984, nearly 40 years after the war, that a British historian named Nigel West tracked him down. West had been researching the double cross system, the British operation that had turned German agents during the war, and he had become obsessed with finding Garbo. Everyone assumed Garbo had died long ago. But West found inconsistencies in the death records. He followed threads through archives and located relatives, and finally discovered that Juan was alive. When West contacted him, Juan was initially terrified. He thought he had been found by the wrong people. But when West explained who he was, what he was researching, Juan finally agreed to tell his story. In 1984, at the age of 72, returned to London for the first time since the war. The British government invited him for a formal ceremony. He met with intelligence officials, historians and veterans who wanted to thank the man who had saved so many lives. Juan died in 1988 in Caracas at the age of 76. His obituary in the Times of London ran just 8 paragraphs. Most people never saw it, but those who knew what he had done understood that the world had lost someone irreplaceable. Because Juan, that courage doesn't require a uniform. And sometimes the most powerful weapon in a war isn't a gun or a bomb or an army. To keep seeing unbelievable historical events like this from the World War II, subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comment where you are watching from.